arqueologia e 53 anos da pesquisa arqueológica no Museu Antropológico da UFG. E a gente vai começar agora com a sessão de conferência, começando com a conferência número 1 do professor Cowell. Hi, Professor. It's wonderful to have you here. We are very happy to have your talk, your lecture. And we want to talk about your work with indigenous people, archaeology, museums, collections. I'm going to do a brief introduction in Portuguese, so very soon we will talk. O professor Cowell atualmente é editor-chefe e fundador da revista Sapiens, uma revista online de antropologia voltada para o grande público, ligada ao Indigenous Foundation, além de atuar como diretor de programa de antropologia e de arqueologia pública nessa fundação. Ele se formou como bacharel em antropologia na Universidade do Arizona, é mestre e doutor em antropologia pela Indiana University. De 2007 a 2020, o professor Cowell foi Senior Curator of Anthropology, curador sênior de antropologia no Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Ele desenvolve diversas pesquisas e trabalhos de divulgação científica, especialmente com povos indígenas, nativos norte-americanos, processo de repatriação e objetos sagrados, e tem diversos livros publicados, entre eles Plunderous Schools and Stolen Spirits, Inside the Fight to Reclaim Native America's Culture. Então, professor, seja muito bem-vindo e muito obrigado por estar aqui. Vamos começar o seminário.
Great, thank you. Bom dia. Hello. I am so honored to be with you today. It's just an amazing opportunity for us to connect North and South America. And today I'm going to be talking about my journey, my career, looking back as a way to also try to understand where we are today as a discipline in archaeology and anthropology more broadly, and where we might go from here. This notion of looking back was really resonant for me when I worked with a Hopi elder named Lee Kiwanuisioma. And Lee, as many Hopis, is a traditional corn farmer. And he shared with me a story of how his grandfather, when they would every year go and plant their corn, which is the process of putting seeds in a long row, that the grandfather always said to him, when you get to the end of the row, take a look back. And what that meant for Lee was for the corn to make sure you have straight rows, but even more to make sure that in life, when you are proceeding and you are trying to plant seeds of something that you want to flourish, you want it to grow, that it's important that you always look back to reflect on where you've been so that you can understand where you're going and where the next seeds can be planted. And so that is a metaphor that I hope all of us can embrace as archaeologists, especially people who look in the past, but as humans as well, to ensure that when we are planting seeds of something we want to grow and flourish, that we're always looking backwards. So I'd like to look backwards a bit on my story to share with you how I got to where I am. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, which is in the southern part of the United States, right next to Mexico. And it's this spectacular and unique landscape of saguaro cactus and thousands and thousands of years of history. And I was lucky enough to have some really amazing teachers through the years. Here's some pictures of some of them who dwelled on the heritage of the borderlands and really embedded in me a love of place and history and people. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was very committed to the work of anthropology and becoming an archaeologist one day. This, however, was also during the period of a lot of controversy and even antagonism between Native peoples and archaeologists. This was in the early to mid 1990s, and the repatriation movement was really taking hold. And it was a controversy and a subject that, as a young person, initially I knew nothing about. You know, I just loved archaeology, I loved history, I was fascinated by Native peoples and their heritage. But as I learned more about the field, I learned about these controversies, and it created a kind of crisis for me because it really made me wonder, you know, how is it that archaeologists can spend their entire lives studying Native Americans and Indigenous culture, but seem to care so little about contemporary religious beliefs, cultural practices, especially around the care of the ancestors and the dead, sacred objects, religious items. How could archaeologists and anthropologists seem to care so little about living people? So it was this contradiction that really sent me into a tailspin, as I wasn't sure I could be part of a field that cared so much about dead Indians, but seemed to be so dismissive of living Indigenous peoples. So I was close enough to graduating from my undergraduate degree that I went ahead and got my degree in anthropology with a specialty in archaeology. But I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I took some time to travel, and I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to be in South Africa and visit Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was held for almost 3 decades. And as I stood there looking at the cell that held Nelson Mandela, I had this kind of revelation that, you know, if you want to see change, if you see a problem in the world that needs solving, it's a burden, it's a responsibility for you to do what you can to address it. So rather than running from the problem that I saw between Indigenous peoples and archaeologists, I committed myself to trying to be a part of the solution. So I went to graduate school, and with the intent of working on this problem of trying to create bridges between Native peoples and archaeologists. And again, I was very fortunate to have the chance to work on a project in southern Arizona, right in that borderlands with Mexico, where we studied the history of 4 Indigenous peoples in this area, one of the last free-flowing rivers in North America, and a place with more than 12,000 years of Native American history. So the project allowed me to work with contemporary Native cultural experts and elders, people like Lee Kiwanuisioma, but also here you see Jeanette Casa from the Apache tribe, Bernard Siqueiros from the Tana O'odham Nation, Octavius Siautewa from the Zuni Nation, and Gordon Yellowman from the Southern Cheyenne tribe. So it was through the work with these elders, these cultural experts, and I was able to be exposed to their wisdom and to begin this work of trying to build bridges between Indigenous peoples and archaeologists in North America. I then was able to put this work to use in a very practical way at a natural history museum in Colorado, where I now live, which is in the western central part of the United States. And I worked at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science as a curator for more than 12 years. And I'll be touching on some of the work that we did, that I was able to do with the collaboration of such good colleagues at the museum. So what is collaborative archaeology? Why do I practice it? Why do I advocate for it? And what effect do I believe it really can have in the world? Archaeology, I think, is now widely understood as a social practice. You know, archaeology, both as the objects of heritage and as a scientific process, is always entwined with the social and political. And we have this now well established through all kinds of research that documents how archaeology becomes inextricably linked to the social worlds that it's embedded in. And we can see this, for example, in the documentation of Nazi uses of archaeology. If we look at what's happening in Palestine and Israel and the use of heritage there, how Stonehenge has become so politicized, the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, the conflict between Muslims and Hindu believers in South Asia, and so many other parts of the world. And all of these help demonstrate how archaeology cannot be extracted from the communities in which it's practiced. Bruce Trigger, many years ago now, documented at least 3 key ways in which archaeology becomes entwined in the social. You have nationalist archaeology, where archaeology promotes notions of the nation, imperialist archaeology, where it's about control and power and influence over neighbors, and a colonialist archaeology, in which often, in this case, European folks are trying to extract resources to create a narrative that fits the story that they want to tell of themselves in a process of extraction and displacement. And while in the United States, which I'm going to be mostly focusing on today, the United States has all 3 forms of this kind of archaeology. It's really colonialist archaeology that has been most prominent in North America for the last almost 200 years. And some of the ideas here is that Native Americans were inherently unprogressive, incapable of adopting a civilized lifestyle, that there were more advanced civilizations. And if you look at some of the most prominent monuments, ancient monuments in North America, this must have been completed by lost people maybe from Israel or Africa or anywhere else, but indigenous peoples themselves. And it severs a connection between deep time and contemporary peoples. And it explains that these kinds of later cultural replacements by indigenous peoples was through their own willful destruction of these places. This kind of narrative continues today. And I'm sorry, I'm seeing the text from my slides didn't quite translate completely. So I apologize for the way it's looking here, but hopefully you can still read it. That this form of colonialist archaeology that began in the 1800s is still very much in place today. And some examples of this include, for example, in the US Southwest, where I work, there's this notion of the people who made some of the most visible ancient sites on the landscape. Those must have been made by vanished and disappeared people that archaeologists have labeled the Anasazi. If you've heard of the Kennewick Man controversy, where a very ancient set of remains, more than 9,000 years old, that became a controversial case of who the descendant communities might be. And you can see in the lower left of the screen here a reconstruction of this ancient man, and the archaeologists explicitly modeled this ancient person on Captain Picard from Star Trek, which is a non-Indigenous person. And he did this very intentionally to try to distinguish this ancient person from contemporary people. Today, too, in the United States especially, there's a lot of fascination around stories and myths of ancient aliens making the places, the ancient places that are honored today. So the critique of colonialist archaeology is now well established, really kicking off in the 1960s and 1970s, very broadly with work like Edward Said's Orientalism, and in the United States, specific critiques by indigenous scholars such as Vine Deloria Jr. And this began a shift in archaeology in the United States First, initially in the 1970s, what was called a kind of public archaeology. But this was really a one-way, one-direction kind of sharing. It was the archaeologists, as you see here in this picture, sitting there in front of people, sharing their knowledge. Eventually, this gave way in the 1990s to what many have called community archaeology, where you have community members themselves doing much of the work. And this is a very dynamic form of archaeology, in my opinion. Community archaeology really does explicitly aim to replace the traditional colonial model of archaeological practice with a socially and politically self-conscious mode of research. So it's a practice of archaeology that's aware of its effects in the world and tries to mitigate the worst impacts of colonialist archaeology by collaboratively working with communities. However, I would advocate for a further form of archaeology that I and others have called collaborative archaeologies. And this very much is born out of community archaeology and has many of the same goals. But I think it's important to move beyond community, because community, intentionally or not, implies that you are working with one group. So you're delineating positionality, geography, and group belonging right from the beginning. Whereas collaboration is a focus on the act itself of working together, and it can see multiple stakeholders, multiple communities, multiple people that archaeologists need to work with. And so it's a much more inclusive framing than just a kind of community archaeology, in my viewpoint. So what does this really look like in practice? A very straightforward model has collaboration beginning with forming a group of co-researchers, community members, stakeholders, the archaeologists themselves, creating conditions for group learning, coming up with questions to explore scientifically and through other methods, acting on those questions, trying to answer them, and then make meaning by constructing group knowledge. So in other words, not prioritizing one form of knowledge over another, but rather bringing multiple forms of knowledge together in one community, one set of practices. And this is important because it creates a more democratic form of knowledge making. This is not research on people, but with them. It brings in a reflexive practice, and it seeks to bridge multiple ways of knowing to make sense of them from different experiences and different worldviews and ways of knowing. And again, I see how these slides are a bit messy. I'm happy to provide them to the organizers, to Diego and his colleagues to share if you'd like to see cleaner versions of these slides later. And so what does this look like in practice and some of the features of it? Well, it's important because it builds interdisciplinary knowledge, right? Because you can't do this work only with the scientific tools of the traditional tools of digging in the dirt, survey, and so on. There has to be humanistic and social science practices built in, especially ethnography. It can connect the past to present, right? Because it establishes that these are living people, but these are living people who are trying to understand the past. It welcomes diverse publics as stakeholders, as community members who have something to say about the world today and the world in the past. And it gives voice to descendant community, and it strives to be applied and action-oriented. So those are some of the features of what this looks like in practice. My colleague TJ Ferguson and I have written that these practices, though, aren't just one thing. This doesn't look, collaborative archaeology isn't just one type of practice, and that is why it's useful in the plural in English, collaborative archaeologies, because you can have a range of possibilities. And so this is what TJ and I have called the collaborative continuum, that shows how you can have everything from a colonial control on one end to indigenous control on the other end. And between those two extremes, you have many forms of collaborative practice that maybe in different moments demand different kinds of relationships. I really want to emphasize that in my view, this collaborative archaeology is not anti-science. It's not unscientific, but in fact, I would argue is a heightened form of scientific practice itself. And we can look to philosophers of science to explain how this kind of bridging of knowledge systems actually is good science. Alison Wiley, for example, has talked about for science to flourish, it must constantly guard itself against the risks of epistemic blindness and epistemic insularity. In other words, when you look at the history of scientific practice, science demands that we have open eyes to all possibilities, and it demands that knowledge itself not become too insular, that we must constantly look for new ideas wherever they might come from. And this is affirmed in Thomas Kuhn's famous work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he argues and documents that the growth of science requires novel ideas and a willingness to challenge accepted beliefs. So often when you are working with indigenous peoples, they are bringing new ideas and they are asking you to challenge your own preconceived notions of what you understand about archaeology, about history, about heritage. And finally, Fricker is another philosopher who's talked about how to allow archaeological authorities to dismiss out of hand, haphazardly, or discriminately alternative ways of seeing the world is a form of epistemic injustice. And what this means is that if we just from the start say, Western scientific, scientific in the sense of the traditional notions of digging in the dirt, if that is the only way to really understand the past, then that is a form of injustice against other knowledge systems that might actually have a lot of power to help illuminate the past in our world today. So I'd like to shift gears to another topic that that is threaded through with these questions of power, knowledge systems, voice, and colonial control, but in a very practical question of who owns or who should control the resources of heritage and from the past. So I think here too, it's important to look back to history to see how we got to this moment. And what's incredibly striking about colonial archaeology is that this notion of extracting indigenous ancestors, their remains and grave goods and their heritage goes back even further than archaeology itself. So when some of the very first Europeans arrived in the eastern coast of North America in what is now Massachusetts in 1620, these very first colonialists were in their first weeks, they were starving and they didn't have enough to eat. So they started to explore the area where they had just arrived, and they found an abandoned village and began to look for food, and they found graves. And when they found these graves, they actually stole those grave goods in that moment. So rather than leaving those places alone, respecting them, they actually extracted and took those things, which essentially established a kind of precedent that you would see in archaeology many centuries later. Native peoples, indigenous peoples in North America have long resisted the extraction of their ancestors' remains. They've just been powerless politically and legally to stop this form of extraction. So this is a really fascinating article that I came across from 1902 that talks about how the remains of a child were unearthed and an archaeologist was sent to dig them. But that archaeologist was told by indigenous peoples living right in that area that he would lose the friendship of the tribe if he dug up any more bodies. You can see too how this notion of just archaeologists and anthropologists going in and being able to take whatever they wanted. This is a very common feature of early anthropology and archaeology. And this is a section of a letter sent by George Dorsey, an early and very prominent anthropologist, that talked about when he, giving advice to another anthropologist that when you go to a village and you want something, you can either find the person who owns it and talk to them. You can offer an exorbitant amount of money for it, or you can steal it. And that he personally has tried all three, and all three of them work just fine. And this was very much the kind of attitude that was in place in our field when it was born in the turn of the last century. But again, indigenous peoples have resisted this. They have demanded their items back since the very beginning of our field. This is the first documented repatriation, a photo from the first repatriation in North America. In 1937, members of the Hidatsa tribe were able to get back a sacred bundle, a religious item that had been stolen from them. In the 1960s and 1970s, indigenous peoples became especially adamant in trying to prevent the theft of their ancestors' remains. This is just up the street at the university where I live, in Colorado, where Indian protesters broke into an anthropology class that was using human remains, and they tried to perform an arrest. They literally took the professor and tried to arrest the professor for grave robbing. And it was these kinds of very high-profile political acts that began to force archaeologists and anthropologists to reconsider what their approach was to Native American and indigenous human remains. And indigenous peoples began to be very successful starting in the 1970s and 1980s to get back their ancestors and their most sacred items. This is a photograph of a elder from the Zuni tribe in New Mexico in the US Southwest, Peri Sadiasi, who was able to reclaim very sacred items from dozens and dozens of different galleries and museums and private collections. And this helped launch the repatriation movement that would become the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, that was passed in 1990, that established a process for Native peoples to reclaim their ancestors' sacred belongings and grave goods. So when I was hired at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in 2007, one of the first things we did was to establish policies that would embrace not just the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law, meaning that, you can sometimes follow the details of a law, but do it in a way that isn't actually creating the possibility of repair and reparations as much as the return of the items themselves. And so you can see, for example, in this very first item in our collection policy, that we would embrace the principles of respect, reciprocity, justice, and dialogue, and that these principles would guide us in our work. And we became very successful, my colleagues and I, and it wasn't just me, it was a whole team of people that helped establish really a set of policies and practices that truly was at the cutting edge of how to comply with NAGPRA. So we published multiple what are called notices of inventory completions, which is a key step in the repatriation process. We returned dozens and then hundreds of different items. And then when all we had left were the indigenous peoples that we knew were indigenous, but we didn't know which tribe at all. We attempted to consult with every single known tribe, Native Alaskan community, and Native Hawaiian organization in the United States, which was more than 800 different tribal communities. And so we did that work for 4 years. And then even when we completed that, we still had some human remains that were not Native American, but we felt we did not have consent to hold them. So we even tried and successfully held consultations on how to handle those people. We also looked far beyond NAGPRA by returning these memorial posts that you can see on this table from Kenya. These are memorial statues that are very, very sacred to an indigenous people in Kenya called the Mijikenda. And these were stolen starting in the 1970s and 1980s. And the Denver Museum of Nature and Science had more of these stolen posts than almost any other museum. And we became among the first to return them to the indigenous communities in Kenya. I also personally worked with the Zuni elder Octavius Siautua. We traveled to Europe to try to convince European institutions to return this very sacred item that you see on the table here called a war god, or Ahayuda in Zuni, and try to have those returned back home. And although that was not very successful, we at least established a kind of foundation for that work to happen. So finally, I would like to turn to another topic that yet again is connected to these questions of power, consent, control, authority, and voice. And it has emerged in the last 10 years as perhaps one of the next great ethical issues for our discipline to face, and that is the question of ancient DNA. The number of ancient genomes published has increased almost exponentially. This is from a paper in 2019, so a little dated, but if you were to continue this, you would only see that curve continue to double and triple and quadruple, because in the last several decades now, in the last 15 years, we have seen more and more of these ancient genomes being published. And this has had a profound impact on how we think about indigenous history, indigenous identity, and the politics and social realities of making the past relevant to today. So there is no question in my mind that ancient DNA is a powerful new tool to illuminate human, biological, and evolutionary histories. It can do all kinds of work for us to help us understand the histories of specific geographic regions. It can help us understand the expansion of language families, the impacts of settler colonialism. It can help us shed light on ancient and ancestral diets and health and disease. So it can do so much in terms of the scientific work of interpreting the past. But at the same time, it has all kinds of risks. And indigenous peoples in particular have profoundly and seriously critiqued this emergent form of scientific practice. Some call it a bone rush, meaning that scientists are just rushing to take whatever they can, in the same way you used to have gold rushes. Some call this the emergence of a smash and grab scientific culture. And it's even a vampire science by some, meaning a kind of predatory scientific practice. And so DNA, ancient DNA has already profoundly shaped concepts of indigeneity, vis-a-vis identity, race, and belonging. This is important in all different kinds of ways. One is that it seems to prioritize and privilege genetic ancestry over how indigenous peoples view their own identity. So it's reducing identity to biology versus identity as a lived experience. These practices of genomicists are often very much replicating the kinds of extractive the kind of extractive practices that we saw in the 19th century, and this notion of that we are all related, or that it's geneticists who are able to determine tribal identities or indigenous identities. This imperils how indigenous peoples construct and configure their own identities, especially around self-determination. And in a very complex way, this is happening because ancient DNA really falls between the cracks, especially in North America, between legal and disciplinary oversight. Because we're dealing with ancient people, when ancient DNA is extracted from ancient people, it is seen as work that is not being done on humans. So it doesn't fall within the human subject kind of ethical framework in the United States and elsewhere. Yet the work itself very much impacts living peoples. And additionally, some of the genetic libraries that are constructed are, in fact, based on the genomics of living populations. So in my view, it involves, past people, but it very much involves living people. But the reality is, in the absence of clear legal oversight, it's really a question of what are the ethical commitments of researchers and institutions to do the work around consultation and collaboration. And I do want to point out, although there are now many controversies of archaeologists and geneticists simply dismissing the work of indigenous peoples, dismissing the perspectives and voices and rights of indigenous peoples, there are in fact groups of researchers who are trying to work in collaborative ways. So for example, the controversy of the Kennewick man, that ancient person that was found 9,000 years ago, can be offset by a comparative example of a skeleton that was found in Alaska in the far northwest part of the United States that dates to 10,000 years ago, where the archaeologists there, instead of trying to battle the indigenous peoples, from the beginning worked collaboratively with them. And what they found, of course, was that indigenous peoples are very much curious about this history. They wanted the genomic work to be done. They just wanted it to be done in a way where their voice and their perspectives, their dignity as indigenous peoples was respected. And so in conclusion, I am continually just amazed by the progress of collaborative archaeologies over the last several decades, the kinds of forms of community-based and indigenous-based archaeology and anthropology that are unfolding. And yet the roots of colonialism persist. The roots of colonialism, I would say, is a kind of weed where maybe you pick out the top, but the roots of the weed continue to grow, and they're very, very difficult to get rid of. And my thinking on this was shaped in part by an anthropologist named Briony Oncule, who talked about naturalized inequalities, where we have so naturalized the structures of power that were created through colonialism that it becomes very, very difficult for us to imagine different forms of relationships and power. And it becomes very difficult for us to enact those. And what this means in reality for archaeologists is that archaeologists often do retain control over money and resources in archaeological practice, right? So if you have archaeological projects, most of that money continues to go to the people with PhDs rather than community members. There are very few indigenous peoples, although this is changing. Relatively speaking, there are still too few indigenous and native archaeologists in our discipline. It's still too often the case that research advances scientific goals rather than the community's goals. It's still too often the case that the rewards within academia disfavor deep collaboration. So for example, we're supposed to get grants and do publications, speak at conferences, and these are the rewards within academia rather than the rewards that come with collaborating with indigenous communities. And finally, archaeologists avoid issues that matter to communities too often. In other words, archaeologists are often focused on our own questions more than the questions or the issues that matter to the community. And so finally, how can we pull up those roots finally, and how can we measure our progress in pulling up those roots? I suggest there are 4 areas that we can do this. The first area we must look at is the political economy of archaeology and ask ourselves, how are the collaborative communities managing their resources? Are strategies realigning historical arrangements of power and money? So in other words, is this collaboration actually changing power relationships and the ability of different communities to use those resources? Second is voice. Whose voices drive the research and its results? Are strategies fostering a critical multivocality? So whose voices are finally heard? And are there methods in place where different voices, meaning multivocality, can be critically brought together to illuminate the past in a more complete and holistic way? Thirdly, to whom do the benefits projects flow? Are relationships mutually enriching and sustaining? So at the end of a project or even the middle of it, who is receiving the most benefits? What does that look like? Is everyone involved being enriched and sustained by the work? And finally, consent. Who is empowered to make decisions about heritage and resources? Are scholars seeking and securing informed consent? So I think this is especially important in the area of ancient DNA, but all forms of archaeology and anthropology. Who exactly is giving permission? Whose voices, perspectives are being empowered in the work of illuminating history? So finally, I would just end with the wisdom again of Lee Kiwanui-Sioma. And he talked always about looking back, but also we are doing this to look ahead. He once said, "Our ancestors left footprints across this land, and it is our duty to ensure these footprints are not erased. We must carry forward what they taught us and make sure that when the next generation looks back, they will see we honored their legacy." Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Thank you, Professor. It's great to hear you. And we're going to open to questions, do a little dialogue, okay? So, anyone quer fazer alguma pergunta?
Pô, velho, pior que é.
Você quer fazer em português?
Não, é difícil entender o que perguntar, tá ligado? Tipo...
So, I'm going to open the questions, okay? I'm going to talk a little about our research in look to, it's strange to look to the camera.
It's too places.
We've been working in this collaborative process, in this collaborative continuum, try to be on the right side of the collaborative. Mm-hmm. But it's, of course, it's hard. We've got a lot of problems in terms of the power institutional powers of academic life. You know, we are a museum of the university, so we have rules and, you know. But what I'm really thinking about in the last, years, it's how can we think and make indigenous knowledge not be just a color in the knowledge, in the final knowledge, because when we take serious the knowledge of the indigenous people, especially the myths, the narratives, and their explanations about the cosmos and how the world function, it's completely different from our archaeological tools,
Mm-hmm.
Capacities of explanation. So how can we, and I'm not asking to make a final statement about this, I know that it's very hard, but I want to listen to you. How can we, for example, put in the same place, in the balance, a myth and radiocarbon rotation, or even if they are in contradiction, how can we deal with this, differences in this kind of knowledge?
It's such a great question because I think what you're asking is in a very practical way, right? So even if you have those commitments, what does that actually look like? How do you bring those worlds together? And as you might suspect, I don't think there's one answer. I think it's going to depend on the work and how you do it. And I think what the indigenous communities want out of the work, out of the research. So, for example, in some of my projects with indigenous communities, they want to see how these can be woven together. They want to say, okay, we have this myth, and you have the radiocarbon dates. Do they match up? Is there a way to make sense of it? And so that kind of research question of how do you braid those together is going to look very different from a situation where, and I've had this too, indigenous people say, it is insulting, like, don't try to add your dates to my myth, right? Those are two different things. And our myth isn't supposed to have a date to it. And, there should be a wall, between those forms of knowledge. So that research project is going to look very different. So I think, in other words, one way to begin approaching it is to ask, what is the goal for that research? Are you trying to bring them together, or are you trying to elevate them both? And it's two kinds of stories, but maybe very different, and you're not trying to bring them together. I was just this last week out doing some field work with the Hopi tribe in Arizona. And it was interesting because we were studying a place with all kinds of archaeology on it. And we had this archaeologist with us on with this project. And the archaeologist kept talking about heritage and history as the pottery sherds and the remains of villages and the lithics and bone, the kind of traditional archaeology. Whereas the Hopi, of indigenous peoples whose ancestors lived there, they kept talking about the animals that were living there, because they believe the animals carry the spirits of their ancestors. And so they see the elk and deer and rabbits and lions that live there as their ancestors still there to protect this place. They talked about the springs, where the water comes up out of the earth, because in the desert, that is very sacred. Those are some of the most sacred places. They talked about the clouds above us that were bringing rain, right? So in other words, in our project, the way I'm getting to your question for this project, we could have just focused on the archaeology in the traditional sense of the pottery sherds in this, because they had a lot to say about that. but instead we reframed it as a landscape study to understand the entire landscape. And when you broaden it out like as a landscape study, I have found that this actually allows you to do a lot of that work at the same time. Because sometimes, you know, an archaeologist like me, I'm not going to have a lot to say about the clouds or the animals living at the sites, but I can include that perspective. So those are like, that's the opposite, you know, they're both equal, but you're not bringing them together. But then at times they would see the archaeology sites and they'd pick up a piece of pottery and they would interpret the designs. And in fact, archaeologists interpret designs as well, right? So in that case, we're bringing it together. So in short, I think we need to look at the project. What is it you're trying to do? But for me personally, a methodology and a theoretical approach of cultural landscapes is one of the best approaches to allow both the different worldviews and at times to bring them together. So I don't know if that resonates with you, if you've thought about more as a landscape study or that, but that's one way I've been trying to approach it for a couple of years now.
Thank you so much. Yes, we take history as in the land as a very start point, and it's been a very important place, important tool for us to think approach to us to think in terms of landscape archaeology, because in the past, the people that we work, Carajá and Nancarajá, they have a giant land and they were excellent riverine, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a long traditional way of relating to the land, and they lost this kind of relation with certain places and their histories and their narratives. So a lot of elder people are talking. The young people don't know about the places. The young people don't go to these places anymore. So we need to rescue this kind of knowledge and this kind of experience. So we approach archaeology, collaborative archaeology, with landscape view, you know.
Yeah. Sounds very similar. And I like what you say too about the reconnection, because of the history of displacement and, you know, how indigenous peoples are so often distanced from their ancestral places. It may not be a matter of simply, you know, an ongoing connection, but it might be an ancient connection that by doing the work of archaeology and landscape study, you're reconnecting them. And that resonates with me very much. I saw that last week, where this project was about 300 miles away from the reservation, but a traditional landscape. So it wasn't just a connection, it was a reconnection. But I think that also speaks to that kind of action-oriented notion of this kind of archaeology, that it's benefiting the indigenous peoples as much as the archaeologists through those reconnections.
Okay. Alguém quer fazer alguma pergunta? So, Professor, I think people are a little shy to speak in English. Okay. Welcome. We want to thank you again for being with us and talk about your research. We like to extend this invitation to another possibilities. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for us.
Thank you. I'm very honored. It's really important for all of us who share this vision and commitment to be able to speak with each other and learn with each other. So I hope this is just part of an ongoing conversation with us. And so I'm very grateful for your work, and I can't wait to read about your work and for us to continue to find ways to get better at doing it. So thank you. Obrigado and ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Valeu.